Okay, so eugenics in short is the practice of controlled selective breeding of human populations. There is positive eugenics, which is encouraging healthy people or people who have desirable traits, presumed desirable traits, to reproduce, and then negative eugenics, which is just the opposite, discouraging people who do not have those desirable traits to not reproduce. Eugenics was founded by Francis Galton, who believed that our physical, mental, and moral traits were inherited, and he thought that only people who had those desirable traits should be allowed to reproduce. After this movement started, a lot of people started to follow in his footsteps. One of the more well-known people was Hitler. In Germany, they would euthanize and sterilize anybody who was considered undesirable. Majority of the people were mentally ill, mentally retarded, or considered undesirable by race. The United States also participated in the movement. There was a lot of restrictive immigration laws passed and sterilization of mentally ill and mentally retarded people. Obviously, now we do not do that. We have now what is called, or what some people call, the new eugenics, which is gene modification. Scientists can change, add, take away DNA from eggs and sperm. A lot of the research now is used for medical reasons, like trying to prevent chronic illnesses and diseases. But there's a lot of people that worry if the research starts to become for enhancement purposes that it will be a new eugenics movement. There's also carrier identification, which is testing for gene mutation, and then pre-implant genetic diagnosis, which is testing embryos, fertilized embryos through in vitro fertilization for any genetic disorders, and then they will only implant the healthy embryos in hopes of the woman getting pregnant, and then they discard the unhealthy ones. For prenatal diagnosis, it's the DNA testing of an already developed fetus for any birth defects or diseases. Okay, so obviously this is a very controversial topic. It's considered to be a social and medical issue, especially in the past when eugenics first started. There was a lot of discrimination going on, and today, even with the gene modification, people are questioning, what is considered desirable and what traits should or should not be selected. And there's also a lot of religious values. People think that scientists are trying to play God by changing DNA and modifying DNA. And then there's also the medical issues. Since it is a fairly new technology, there's not a whole lot of research done on it, so there's kind of the fear of the unknown. There's no way to know how this will affect an individual and how it will affect society, and then there's also risks involved. So some of the advantages are the technological advancement. Obviously, we've come very far with technology. This has never been done before. And then there's the potential to prevent chronic diseases and allow our children to live longer and healthier lives. And then there's also the benefit of knowing if your child is going to have problems later on, like genetic illnesses. And this allows parents to prepare as needed, either to educate themselves on how to better raise their child, or if they decide to terminate the pregnancy. There's also disadvantages. Like I said earlier, it can be medically dangerous, and it's also expensive, and the unknown effects and outcome from these new technologies. And there's also the social and ethical concerns about what kind of traits should be selected and how far is too far. Okay, so as far as legislations for eugenics, in December 2015, the Senate voted for the Eugenics Compensation Act, which was to help surviving victims that were forced to be sterilized. Currently, there are 40 or more than 40 countries that have laws prohibiting genetic modification of humans, but the United States is not one of them. But the RAC and the NIH are not accepting clinical trials for genetic alterations at this time. And also the Dickey-Wicker Amendment prevents federal funding of research involving any creation or destruction of human embryos.
There was a lot of different lab techniques that were used for eugenics, especially back then, and there's still some that that still happen today. But one of them is mutation detection, and that is to see if there's any mutations in the DNA sequence. So you can see if someone has like a disease or anything of like a disorder or anything before. So that is one example. Another one is genetic engineering. So it is a combination of you can recombine DNA, molecular cloning, and transformation, and then the ending result is a genetically modified organism or plant. So an example of this would be like crops. That's one main example. Another lab technique is gene therapy, and then that is a procedure that involves inserting human genes into somebody, and it helps them prevent any like cancers that could happen or any disorders. And then another technique is personal genomics, which is basically just the study of the structure and function of genes. And then they can also use this to personalize medicine that can help somebody, and it's like personalized just for them. So that's really interesting. But there are some examples of eugenics. So it's like in the early 20th century, there was multiple cases of women giving birth and right after they were sterilized without consent. And it mainly happened to like the poor people or like non-white races, especially like Native Americans. But there was a woman named Carrie Buck. She was the first person to be sterilized in Virginia. And then Native Americans were greatly affected by this eugenics and sterilization movement. But people who are against eugenics, they do want to have other ways other than sterilization, and that includes like birth control and abortions to women. So they have that choice. Many in this whole world. It impacted millions in different countries and even here in the United States, but it is still very present to this day. Many that were against this practice of eugenics, that include like scientists and advocates for to stop this practice, but they basically said that it was ethically wrong to do this, and especially for example to a group that was mentally ill. Scientists said that mental illness was not even related to genes, so how could this practice target a group like that when it's not even related? So that was their argument. But eugenics, it was biased against people who did not have opportunity, such as like lower class citizens, non-white races, and the mentally ill. But a good example today in the modern day would be a woman testing her fetus to see if there is a genetic disorder of some like, that they have a choice to abort the fetus if they would like, or they can choose a different path. But this is where the ethical and legal concerns come about, as in if abortion is ethical or not. So a woman has their own choice to do that, and that is still one of the biggest arguments today, is abortion and even like genetically testing a baby to see if there is a disorder. But there is a professor over in London. His name is Michael Butler, and he's basically saying that everybody should get the equality of opportunity, and that includes like the lower class, people who are different races, like minorities, and the mentally ill. So he does not support eugenics. But a little historical background comes from the late 19th century and early 20th century, where here in the United States, eugenics was fairly accepted, but there was a lot of sterilizations. There's around 60,000, and there was 20,000 alone just in California. But during the World War II, to justify his killings and the sterilizations that he did, and he was saying that He was getting rid of the unfit so they did not have to reproduce. So this was his way of justifying his actions. But shortly after the war, eugenics, it fell out of Germany, and it still continued in the United States shortly after that.
Okay, so as far as legislations for eugenics, in December 2015, the Senate voted for the Eugenics Compensation Act, which was to help surviving victims that were forced to be sterilized. Currently, there are 40 or more than 40 countries that have laws prohibiting genetic modification of humans, but the United States is not one of them. But the RAC and the NIH are not accepting clinical trials for genetic alterations at this time. And also, the Dickey-Wicker Amendment prevents federal funding of research involving any creation or destruction of human embryos.